you can't manage something if you can't measure it. And then you can't maximize something if you're not managing it. And so having an idea of what are your goals and the handful of KPIs that you should look at so that you could have an intuition on a weekly basis of how you're doing towards those.
This is You Should Talk To, a podcast for busy marketing leaders who are looking for support and tips on getting shit done. In each episode, Daniel Weiner interviews marketing leaders and discusses their experience, successes, and failures around hiring agencies. If you're interested in finding and choosing the right agency partner, then let's jump in.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the You Should Talk To podcast. I am Daniel Weiner, and this podcast is brought to you by myself, as well as You Should Talk To until a sponsor ponies up the big bucks. You Should Talk To pairs brands and marketers for free with vetted agencies and or freelancers for pretty much any marketing or tech need, because finding great agencies is a pain in the ass. Today, I am joined by the head of digital growth at Blaze Pizza, Hedy Payghambari. How are you, Hedy?
Hey, good morning.
This was took us quite a few emails to get this scheduled, so I'm especially thrilled to not have to go back and forth on dates anymore with you.
I know. I'm pumped to be here, though. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive right in. What is your most unpopular opinion in the marketing world, or a hot take of sorts? What do you got for me?
I don't think it's unpopular, but it might be more on the hot take side of things.
We'll take it. We love controversy here on the podcast.
Controversy, yes. So whether in-house or agency or working with both, I come from business background, growth marketing, performance marketing background and I work in digital too, which a lot of things are measurable. So it's kind of like a blessing and a curse where you can measure things, but it can get overwhelming on how many things you should measure, how often. But my hot take is, in order to really know where you're going, you have to look at things on a weekly basis. And I'm not talking about like every metric and every KPI, but if you have a goal, it doesn't make sense to look at things monthly. And this is where, you could argue for and against, where if you're looking at it monthly, that's where you see trends, right? But monthly or quarterly QBRs, they're not fast enough to pivot based on insights and where consumers are going and just things that are not working. And so that's my hot take. And I've had healthy conversations and frictions with both internal teams and agencies of like, okay, how much do you measure and how often in order to be effective to reach your goals?
Yeah. One of my somewhat hot takes is that if you measure too much as well, like if you only do things that are measurable, you'll never do any of the cool stuff, presumably, or try and fail and find what really works. But is what you're talking about more like a case for having live dashboards and stuff like that that's constantly pulling in, metrics?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There's some things that can't be quantified, right? Like it's really difficult to measure brand awareness on a weekly basis. So those are some things where there's more gray area. But for when it comes to driving sales through digital, like, do you have an understanding of CPM week over week? Sometimes it spikes and like what impacted that? And should you invest more? Should you invest less? Same with like your cost per acquisition or your conversion rates. There's things that break. There's things that are out of your control. There are, again, changes in the economy. So just having a pulse on some of your main KPIs on a weekly basis, rather than like, to your point, you can also get, what's that saying, like paralysis by analysis. And so, but for me, the hot take is like, you can't manage something if you can't measure it. And then you can't maximize something if you're not managing it. And so having an idea of what are your goals and the handful of KPIs that you should look at so that you could have an intuition on a weekly basis of how you're doing towards those areas.
I would imagine it's especially relevant in the context of Blaze Pizza with how many locations and seasonality, regional stuff, and the amount of just different moving pieces around the business, which leads into, like, for those who haven't heard of it yet, tell us a little bit about Blaze Pizza and where you guys fit into the world.
Yeah. So Blaze Pizza, we're LA based. We've been around. We're just celebrating our 10-year anniversary. We have over 340 some locations. And you may have heard, yes, LeBron James is an investor. So he's he's our claim to fame.
I've heard of him.
Right.
We couldn't get LeBron on the podcast, so we settled for you.
I know. I'm sorry. I'll try next time. You'll have to settle for me in this scenario. And we're chef founded. So our chef, who was one of the founders, is still with the brand. So that's a really exciting part for me as our innovation and our footprint. We're kind of like the Chipotle of pizza, where you have so many fresh ingredients to choose from, and you can go down the line and pick out your crust, your toppings, and then it's baked right in front of you in this really hot fire roasted oven, and you can enjoy it right out of that fresh hot experience. So that's a little bit about Blaze.
That's amazing. I'm just curious, not necessarily even as it pertains to pizza, but just being in a space where you're competing for attention against, several other competitors. How do you feel like a brand can stand out, when it comes time to order pizza or, anything in that space? What can you do to gain like a competitive advantage, to be front of mind for folks?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring up pizza because, it's the number one food category in the US. There's so much noise around it. But I think it comes back to the same marketing principles. And even before pizza, I was actually on the agency side where I had range of clients from Jeep and Chrysler to makeup to literally a surgical suction like equipment company, like the variety of and guest experiences. And I think what it all comes back to, how you stand out, is do you understand the need state of what your customer wants and when they buy what they want? And how can you be top of mind for when they're making that decision? For pizza, most people make their decision that day. You're not planning like 4 days in advance of like, I want pizza on X day. And so again, I think it's understanding the need states. And then the other piece is just, and this is what I think a lot of brands, no one has perfected it yet, but it's being authentic in your marketing. Everything from the tone that you speak in to the way you present yourself, but also and the way you target your guest. So I think we're at the point now in technology where guests expect a more personalized one-to-one communication. So if I'm a vegetarian, how do I not get the pizza that's all about meat toppings, right? Or if I'm someone who buys pizza every week, how should my communication be different than somebody who is a 1 to 2 time purchaser? So I think that's really the key, and it's more of an art than a science of how to stand out, is understanding your guests through industry research, through first party data, third party data, and then just trying to appear when they're at the point of when they need your product, rather than doing a one-to-many communication and blast.
Sure. And I know that you weren't there during COVID, but do you think like you have any grand takeaways regarding food industry post-COVID and like how to reach customers? I know even my dining habits as someone who considers himself, even though I hate the word a foodie, have changed drastically. Truthfully, have you seen any like huge takeaways or anything that surprises you in a post-COVID atmosphere?
Not surprised, but I think it's what excites me, which is after COVID, and this is not news to anyone probably listening, but digital jumped like 10 years. And for any restaurant, I think the industry number is like 1/3 of restaurant sales come through a digital channel. So that's a thing that changed. And that's now the challenge for marketers, which is like, okay, how do you scale this? How do we, now that we're kind of 2020 and 2021 were weird years. I'm so glad to not have to do year-over-year comparisons anymore. And now that we're entering a quote-unquote new normal, how do we keep the momentum going so that we have more people that we can speak to online than we ever have before? But with great power comes great responsibility to also make sure that you're creating a better experience for the guests. So I think that's the biggest takeaway and just what excites me overall about digital. And I love this field because it's always changing. It's never the same. You never get bored. And that's I think that's the excitement ahead.
Awesome. I wasn't expecting a Spider-Man quote on this podcast. So I hope YouTube doesn't flag this for copyright infringement. I'm especially curious since you come from agency world, what's your overall opinion of agencies? Even though that is my business, and I support folks like you, they get a bad rep sometimes. Everybody has a negative agency experience. Do you think you're a little more sympathetic to agency practices and their woes coming from that world?
You become more sympathetic, but I think I love having worked in an agency and in-house because it really does give you the POV of both, where you're more sympathetic, but it's also your expectations are higher because you know what goes on behind the scenes. And I think, agencies are absolutely necessary based on where you are in your business. And I'm kind of on the mindset that when you're small and starting, you need outside expertise to scale. So that's where you need agencies. Then you hit this like middle tier where maybe you've scaled some things and you're looking to bring some things in-house because you are strong in some areas, you still need external partners in some areas. And this is another hot take, some you could just agree or disagree. And then you hit
very controversial. This whole episode is riddled with controversy.
And Spider-Man quotes, apparently. And so when you hit a scale of another size where you're larger, I think that's when you almost go back to some agent. So it's almost like this, like downward problem of like needing external sources to scale. Oh, I have some things figured out. I'm going to bring some things in-house. And then, I'm too large again, and I really need to seek external expertise to scale. And so I think, again, agencies based on where you are, what part of your business, your need state are definitely key, and they're a great toolkit to have. But both a love and hate relationship sometimes.
That aligns with most of the people I interview on this podcast. Mostly the hate part is just because of bad sales practice, which kind of moves into the next, a very natural segue, an unintended one. Most people I talk to with your title, especially at, big or well-known consumer-facing brands like Blaze and stuff like that, are getting inundated, 20 times a day on LinkedIn, text, phone calls, emails, the whole shebang. Is that consistent with you? Are you getting hit up by agencies and vendors cold every single day, essentially?
Oh, yeah. You betcha.
And are any of them, or would you say the vast majority are not targeted in any capacity and they have done zero research on you or your business?
Unfortunately, I would say like 85% are like that. And it is really alarming. And you can tell. And again, I have such empathy for people doing this because that's your job. It's a numbers game. It's like, how many people can I reach out to see who I can get a response from? But you can also tell it's a numbers game because the number of times I'll get an email or I'll get calls on my personal phone number. And I'm like, how did you find me? And like, how did this happen? But I think the number of emails or outreach on LinkedIn or work email or even personal email somehow, again, is found that you get that's so broad. That's like, oh, hey, I know you might be busy, just bumping this up in your inbox. And that's like how you immediately lose me. Or, oh, I have this XYZ solution, would love to talk to you. And for me, I love learning about new things that are happening, whether it's agency or technology, but we're also all dealing with finite amount of time in your week. And so the pitches that stand out the most are the ones that have done the research to at least show you like, hey, here's my solutions. This is XYZ. This is a case study, or here's a video to watch for 2 minutes on who we are, or here's some results. Here's some like clients we work with, and actually give me a sense of, oh, you have done a little bit of research to understand my business problems because you at least know the food industry or the pizza industry or a company of my size. And then they'll talk about the solutions that are there and then offer some type of incentive for your meeting. And I'm not talking about like, give me something for free. I'm talking about like, hey, we'd love to do a complimentary audit. Like, I don't need a bottle of wine. I need I want an audit of where I stand against my competitors and then to see how you help me. But it is 10 to 15% do that, and the majority, unfortunately, do not.
Yeah, over the course of my career, I've probably done every bad sales outreach in some capacity at some point in my life. There's, I consider him a friend, Will Allred, if you know that name. He's on LinkedIn. He's the co-founder of Lavender, which is like an AI email tool. And he always says your prospect is not thinking about you, which is something that kind of like, once I saw it, I was like, oh, you're right. Like they're literally never thinking about it. So like when you talk about like, oh, like just bumping this up in your email, which I get from people 50 times a week as well, I'm just like, has this ever once worked? Like, it can't. Surely it has not. But then I'm like, it has to have worked once, at least once, because like they're still doing it. And I truthfully don't know. I think a lot of it's, I have empathy too. And I think it's like interesting when people on LinkedIn, especially like call out, salespeople. And I'm like, we should be calling out the sales leaders, I think, like who have enabled this and said, yeah, like this is the strategy we're going after.
And can I just say another struggle or pet peeve I have is, let's say someone really does have a good intro email and I'm like, oh yeah, I'd love to talk to you. I've also had it happen where like multiple intake calls are required until I learn about your product. And again, I totally understand you're doing your due diligence. You need to understand my business, but I can't do like 2 to 3 intake calls with every company that does an outreach. It's like, we have half an hour together or hour at most. Like, let's swap some learnings and see what some ideal outcomes would be, as opposed to just like, okay, this is a great intake call. Now this, and then, can we sign an NDA and we'll get more information to you? And by that point, I'm just like, oh my goodness, like, again, empathy, but I also need outcome.
Yeah, I think it's truthfully in that scenario, a lot of vendors and agencies, truthfully, they prioritize like perfection in terms of qualifying versus like a lot of the coaching I give to my agency partners is like, you should make it astronomically easy to say yes to something. An easy way to get started in any capacity. Again, it depends on the scenario, but in the context of like, yeah, I'm interested, let's get started on something, like there should be something easy that can be put together to say yes in virtually any context, I firmly believe. If you're talking about like a full-fledged agency of record thing, probably not. You need, access to a million different things. Absolutely. There's a contracting thing, but like for plenty of vendors, even things I've signed up for, like, oh, we want to get you on with this. I'm like, I'm ready to buy, take my money, and they won't, which I think is hysterical.
Exactly.
Is there anything you think these people can do to stand out? Or is it more just like if it's timely and somewhat relevant?
Demonstrating understanding of my business or the industry. I understand sometimes, again, there's a lot of information out there about pizza, and you can even research in digital. You can go look up all my platforms and have a POV on what, we're doing well or not. So I think coming to the table with a stance, because that's why you hire external partners, is like, we hire you because you have a point of view in the space and you're so good at it that I want you to pull me in, like take me along with your vision. So I think that's the part. It's at least showing an understanding of the industry, whether it's pizza or certain technology or service, and then coming and identifying the problems that you see and then how you're going to be able to help solve it, I think is what makes people stand out. And also persistence, because right now my need state might not be XYZ, but talk to me in 6 months and it might be. And I love vendors who check in, not to just say like checking in, like, can we meet again? But rather, hey, here's a case study that we published that you may find interesting based on these like couple of things you told me, or here's a blog, or like, oh, here's this thing that made me think of you. Hope you find this information. And then you're top of mind, but you're not asking for meetings, and, you're not just like doing something to do something, but providing intelligent conversation points. So that way I can be like, oh yeah, wow, this is a good case study. Like I'll have 5 minutes to skim something. So showing understanding of the industry or business and then following up with relevant information is what would probably make and has made agencies stand out to me before.
It's funny you bring that up about sending case studies. Because I think in the agency world, it's so largely relationship driven. And as coming from an agency background of someone selling, like I totally get it. It's funny to hear that because I talk to so many people with your title, CMOs, VPs of marketing, all that. And so many tell me, I don't want your bullshit case study, like as your follow-up or something like that. And I hear plenty that say the other side, what you said of like, yeah, I want to see something that actually makes sense other than that. Which goes back to like the overall, thesis of basically my entire company is nothing matters outside of knowing your audience. Like whoever is trying to attempt to talk to you and knowing within reason, again, it's hard to know right away, but like knowing what drives you and what makes you tick and what, makes you successful in your job in the context of Blaze Pizza and stuff like that, while simultaneously not coming off too thirsty, for lack of a better word. And it's that fine line because it's a song and dance. At the end of the day, like you know that they want your business and they know that you know that they want their business, and it's figuring out that nuance of like, not coming off as annoying, truthfully, while still providing some layer of value until you're ready to actually have an actionable conversation.
So another hot take, 'cause I completely agree with you that some case studies are BS, but you can tell a vendor that knows what they're doing by the way they do their case studies and the way they annotate things and the way they like measure lift. So it even gives me a sneak preview of how you will measure my work in a potential relationship.
You're going to get 700 case studies in the next like 3 to 5 weeks from vendors being like, check out this case study we did. Look at all these case studies. So many case studies for you.
Damn it. Yeah, it's
I
happening.
think I know. I was going to say, I think I know the answer to this next question since it's how we got connected. But when you do need to outsource something, where are you typically starting your search? And, is it existing relationships, colleagues, communities, dare I say Google, which no one answers these days? I'm just curious. Where are you typically starting?
Community, first place, because you want to hear of successful relationships and what problems they've solved. So I would say community is the first place. Just peers, mentors, reaching out to your network and being like, hey, this is my problem. Who have you seen solve this well? I think the second area would be groups or partners that specialize in this, such as yourself or another one that I won't name, and that they're really well connected with agencies to see, okay, who's good in this space? And you can, right? There's a certain level of vetting that's already been done. And then especially in my world with technology, I think the third area is reaching out to your existing partners, because it becomes more difficult to bring on agencies who don't have experience with the existing technology. So oftentimes I've gone to tech partners and said, who do you work with well? And that's been another way to get recommendations.
No, it makes total sense. In general, once you do, start that process of looking for an outsourced solution for, say, technology or a vendor or an agency, what in general are you looking for that would make, one or two stand out amongst the rest and make it to your short list of sorts?
I mean, this is probably a cliche answer, but looking for a partner that can demonstrate they understand your problem. So when we were talking about like intake calls, right? It's like, I don't want to do multiple introductory meetings, but when you are trying to select an agency, that's where you're absolutely yes. Like, let's talk. I will offer you my time. I need you to have time to ask the right questions in order to understand the problems that you're solving. So I think the number one need is having an understanding of the opportunities as well as the weaknesses. Because sometimes like we keep solving for like the business problems, but it's also like, what do you see me doing well that I should lean into more? So that being the first. And then second is partners that are proactive and that are pulling you. And I think there's a place where you are partners and there's a place where you're pulled. But ultimately, I've always wanted partners who are like, hey, this is where we're going. And like, we're taking you with us and here's the benefits and here's the risks. Like, do you want in or out? So I think for me, those are proactiveness, understanding of the business, and then also act as an extension of your business, because you bring on an agency and then COVID hits, or you open X number of stores, or you're facing another, like a, potential or a receptionist coming on board. So we can't operate our services the same way. So an agency that would take a step back and be like, hey, we pitched you X, Y, and Z, but actually like maybe it should change because I learned more about you and not just do something because we've always been doing it that way.
Yeah, proactiveness is typically the biggest thing I hear when I ask that question. There's usually a caveat. It's proactiveness and like coming with ideas and stuff like that, as long as every single idea is not associated with a dollar amount or like a new sale or like rescoping and stuff like that, which is, I think, why I see a lot of misalignment on the front end. I talked about this, I think, on the last podcast episode we recorded. Like, I think typically what brands want, or what I hear when I speak to them is they want, and you just, kind of hit the nail on the head, like an inherent level of flexibility. COVID hits or something, say, drastically less severe. Something changes. You want to be able to manipulate a scope or services, stuff that makes sense for the business. Mm-hmm. Rightly so. Agencies, in their ideal world, your scope would never change. And your services would stay the same. The amount of time it takes would allow them to staff it correctly. It would, make everyone's lives easier. And that's just not how the world works. So I, usually advising folks to figure that out on the front end, like when stuff inherently changes, when we open a new restaurant, when a restaurant, hopefully it doesn't, but closes or things like that. Like, how are we shifting this scope? How is that going to affect budget and all that stuff? But I feel like those conversations most of the times happen like when it's too late, unfortunately. Like, you're already in a weird state. And have you experienced that at all? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think some of them are predictable, but some of them are also not. Because when you sign on to work with a client, you have an assumption of everyone's strength, their strengths and weaknesses. And then you work with them and then you're like, oh, actually, that's your weakness or that's your strength. So I think there's some that you can predict and then some you can't. And so that's where that, but also get it, right? Like if you are an agency, you have to staff your team and you have to be able to hit certain projections and things like that. But there's that inherent learning that comes from working with a client for 6 months to a year, where you're gonna find things out about them that might make you, if you could go back, pitch services in a different way.
No, and I love another natural segue. I've seen a big shift since COVID, especially of brands, especially more household name brands, moving towards smaller independent agencies that are specialized in like 1 to 2 things versus like agencies of record and things like that. Do you have an opinion on that? Is that something that you think is here to stay? Is that something you're interested in particular? Talk me through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost every marketer that I speak to in my network is going through the same progression of, do you go with an AOR? Do you go with multiply specialized agencies, or do you bring things in-house? And so there's benefits.
What's your preference?
My preference is also not the realistic. So I think it's easier to work with an agency that does multiple things for you because you get scale. And the people become more integrated in your business and they understand you. You don't have to play the telephone game multiple times. So there's certain efficiencies that come with that. But on the downside, I also don't think one agency can do everything for you. That's not fair. Like there's no way that you can do like 7 things well. You might be able to do 1 or 2 things really well. And so that's where it might make sense to centralize, where you're like, okay, I know this agency does these 2 things really well. This third thing, not so much, but I'm getting that synergy of having it all in one place. Or you could be better off working with, 3 different agencies that do 3 separate things and move at a faster pace because they're so good at what they do. But then there's a little bit of that inefficiency and likely higher cost that comes with it. So again, one of those like art, not a science, and you have to look at your business and based also on where you are in your maturity of which relationships you lean into more.
Yeah, I think COVID kind of was like a great displacement as well. Like talent is everywhere. It's not necessarily centralized to New York or LA or anything like that. And also just smaller independent agencies which is who I primarily work with, they are hungrier. And I firmly believe that, business is more important to them inherently because it's a bigger piece of their revenue and keeps their team going and stuff like that. So I know a lot of the agencies I work with are willing to go to the ends of the earth to win particular clients and stuff like that. Whereas bigger agencies are not always willing to go the extra mile pre-sale, and they expect to win a little bit more, which is not the case, I would say.
Right, because they're leveraging their expertise in this space as the driver.
Absolutely. Can you think of a really positive agency experience you've had either at Blaze or in the past, and what made it so positive?
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely had good ones. In a role that I had, we were building a new website. We worked with a really great agency who, when they were pitching, truly sold the people. And it was the people that made the difference. Because the team you were talking to, some of them stayed from the pitch to the team that actually worked with you. And that's something that changes, right? Is you get pitched by one team, and then the team that works with you is very different. And so it was one of those that felt like they knew our problems as well as we did, if not better. And it was awesome. And I loved having conversations where, I'm pretty opinionated about some things I want to get solved. And then they would be like, we hear you. And here's a couple of examples of, yes, we could go this ways. And here's an example of like, we shouldn't. It was really healthy intellectual pushback of what's best for the guest. And I would work with them in a heartbeat again, because it was, again, the people truly made the difference because they understood the business and we were able to have really good conversations around what is best for our end consumer at the end of the day.
And it's funny you bring that up because it's kind of my hot take, which you further prove, so it will remain, is I'm sure the website ended up being wonderful, but you didn't mention the actual work once in that description. And my hot take is that the work doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is if you don't do the people stuff on the front end and earn trust, like you don't get to do the work. You could build the best website on the planet, have the most talented developers and designers, but if you can't figure out the first part, you don't get to do the second part. And coming from agency background, like we did a lot of big website work in my old agency. And I can't think of a single time, truthfully, that we would get to the end and the compliments would be like, oh, the website is gorgeous. It would be like, yeah, like, thank you for making this kind of like stress-free. Like this was such a long, arduous process. Thanks for like making it reasonably fun. You know, it was never like, oh, the homepage is like the best homepage I've ever seen in my life. So yeah, I firmly believe the people side, and it's rare, truthfully, too. That's the most common thing I hear regarding bigger agencies typically is, yeah, you're pitched by, you know, the A-team, quote unquote, and then they go back to, you know, their offices Mad Men style to have a drink and a proverbial cigarette, and you get the people you've never seen before doing the actual work.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's the process, making the process frictionless and being proactive. Those are the things that you remember more than, yeah, the product you built. That's such a good point.
And making your life easier, I would imagine, too. You've got a million things going on. If you're hiring somebody and paying them a ton of money to build a website, it should be, I know you have to be involved, but it should be make your life easier and free up time for you to do other stuff as well, I imagine.
For sure.
Let's talk some shit now. Let's talk about the negative ones without naming anybody. Negative agency experiences that you've had and what made them so negative.
Lack of proactiveness and curiosity. So similar things
Pre-sale
to what I think,
or post or once engaged?
During engagement, post in this scenario where I think, again, businesses change, even account management changes, right? Like new people come into roles, people leave. And so you have to your earlier point of like understanding the people, you have to take a step back and be like, okay, do I know this person's pain points? Am I working best to suit their needs? And has the business changed as a result of all this? And I think the example in my mind where it was really frustrating is stating a friction point. Like I'll be like, hey, this is a problem for me. And it's really well received, but then the solution is like only like 20% solved. And coming back and saying like, hey, there's still this friction point and feeling like you're pulling them. Where for me, I'm like, a great partnership is like, hey, this is a problem for me. Like, please go and solve it. And you come back with really solid solutions of like, hey, this is 3 different ways we could go. And here's the good, here's the bad. Let's decide together. Because I don't expect every agency to solve everything on their own. Should be a collaboration, but at least help me understand my options and the good and bad on each so we can make a decision that we feel good about. So I think that's when problems arise and agencies are not solution oriented and don't think creatively around a solution is the part that has frustrated me in the past.
Do you think once a agency or vendor relationship has gotten to that point where there is, you know, some friction or some sort of issue that it can be salvaged and brought back to, you know, long-term success? Or once the bad taste is in your mouth, it's kind of meh?
Yeah, it's tricky. I am an eternal optimist, so I do want to think that yes, because sometimes we're not good clients or the agency is not performing well because we haven't define clear goals or we haven't given them what they need. So I think when an agency relationship is in question, like we all have to ask ourselves that of like, have I been a good client? Have I given them what they need to succeed? But again, also on them, are you being proactive and being like, you're not giving me what I need in order for me to set you up for success? So it's a two-way road, but I do think they can be salvaged if we proactively talk about the problems. And it's the same way that you know, you would give a performance review to an employee. You know, you're not going to wait 3 months and then tell them something. So I think being proactive and real time about, hey, this is an area that we could improve, or like this worked really well. Can we do more of this? Is what you can do to help foster a relationship. But again, I think that the agency has to be asking those very same things. And if it happens, there's potential to foster that relationship, whether you're changing your process or you're changing the people on the account. Again, you have to think of the solution together and not in silos.
It's similar to your very first hot take of, you need to measure on a weekly basis. You may not like do that formally with partners, but you should probably be measuring the success of a relationship on a pretty frequent basis, even if it's just internally to say like, hey, do we still like these people? Is it still working out with them? And all that sort of stuff with whoever's involved in the relationship.
Oh, I love it. You just made a full circle from me. I'm going to use that from now on.
That's what we're here to do on this podcast, What are you most bullish on in the marketing space at the moment? And I imagine for a brand like Blaze, I could be wrong here, but I would guess I'm not. Like you've got a good amount of leeway to try cool stuff because it is, a cool brand and you're in pizza and stuff like that. You've got NFTs, we've got metaverse, we've got TikTok, all the things. What are you most excited about in marketing in general or as it pertains to Blaze?
Yeah, you're right. There's so much we can do. Like food is fun. Pizza is fun. There's so much we can do. I wish I was at the phase where I could entertain Web 3.0 or NFTs and things like that. But with my role, I am more at the foundational stage where I'm building my team and building. We've done a lot. We have a lot of great foundation in place, but we have more work to do. And so I think I'm focused more on setting the foundation to help us scale in the future. And then once that happens, being able to engage in more of these like shiny new objects that come up. But I'm also excited to see other brands do it and see which ones were fads and which ones are here to stay. So, kind of from a industry perspective, I do like keeping up to date and just seeing where things go and having some of the bigger brands, maybe with bigger budgets, lead the charge and see what's the fad and what's the new normal.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to hear you say that too, because I firmly believe like anytime I don't fault them because it's always good to experiment and test, but like every time something new pops out, I think it's interesting that people just flock like immediately. And, it's okay for you to not participate in some of these things that pop up. A new social network pops up every single day. I was reading an article about like how brands can engage and be real. And I'm like, can we just... They don't have to either. Like I figured out the answer. The answer is you don't have to. Like, again, I'm not discouraging testing and all that sort of stuff, but it's overwhelming the amount of things you can participate, especially when you are like a quote unquote cool brand, because you can try all of these things and it not be like, so out of the norm.
Yeah. And if you have a big enough team and budgets where you do have some innovation, then yes. But I think for a lot of other brands, I can do 10 things and kind of half do them, or I can do 5 or 3 things really well. And those are the strategic conversations you have to have internally to be like, ooh, shiny new thing, but like, I got to finish what I started here. Or, oh, shiny new thing. Wait, there's a business case for that. And maybe it would make sense for me to participate.
That's what all those case studies that are going to fly in are going to be, all these new business cases for all these new platforms.
I'm going to regret having said that now.
You should. I'll blur that part out. What keeps you up at night from a marketing and business standpoint?
I feel like I need like a therapy couch for this to like lean back.
This is basically I'm not kidding. The majority of the conversations I have when I'm like helping folks with their agency needs turn into therapy sessions. So I'm like, this is a safe space. We don't even have to make introductions. Let's just talk. And they're like, oh, thank God.
Safe space with only, whoever else is listening. What keeps me up at night is the pressure of meeting long-term objectives and short-term sales goals, because they're always there. And especially being in industries, B2C tends to be more impacted, right, by what's happening in the economy. And so it is, how do you not sacrifice long-term growth and still keep your eye on what needs to be done today in order to hit something a year from now, right? Like if you're talking about marketing automation or customer insight platforms and things like that, you build those. They take time, or you build a loyalty program. These things take time. You don't see the gains immediately. And then you have to have the right people hired to maximize them. But you also have short-term sales goals you have to hit. And so it's that balance that is both exciting as a digital marketer, but also on the flip side, keeps you up at night.
Yeah, I think it's important to have leadership that is realistic, as to what's going on in the world, and also like, forecasts and hitting short-term goals are great and stuff like that. But there's so many outliers of things that affect, especially in consumer-focused businesses, and not, like you said, straying too far and like getting discouraged and changing a million things at the first sight of, something being unsuccessful in exchange for hopefully achieving long-term goals and success and sustainability over time.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I think having a leadership team that is aligned and understands that too is significant in making that's digital successful for the long run, because it's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. And you have to figure out, okay, what are the short terms and what are the long terms, and how do we do both at the same time?
Sure. Now that I've stressed you out successfully, we'll move on to it. We'll finish with a couple fun ones. The first one, what do you think of industry events? You are one of the most sought after titles to attend industry events. Agencies attend to vulture business and get in front of you and stuff like that. Rightly so. That is their jobs. I have empathy for that. I'm just curious, like in your ideal world, what would be, an event you would like to attend, or how would it be structured and stuff like that?
Ideal world? I think for marketers, it's so great when you can speak with people who do what you're doing. Like I get the most energy out of that when I go to events where you can sit next to someone and be like, oh, you were experiencing this problem. How are you solving that? Or, oh, wow, that's something really interesting you're doing, and just building your network in that way, I find super, super valuable. But it is challenging when you attend summits, and rightfully so, agencies sponsor it, right? So they also want your time and attention. But I think there's tactful ways to do so, all the ways that we just described, where trying to have a 15-minute or 10-minute conversation in a happy hour is not the most effective, maybe to get into my business problems and what needs to be solved. And
sure,
like you said, again, and I have the utmost respect and sympathy for it, but it does turn into, like you said, a little bit of that like vulture business where it's like, oh, I want to network with, if I'm at an event, I want to talk to people who do what I'm doing and meet peers and maybe even meet a couple of vendors. But it turns into like, you have your name tag and everyone's reading your name to try to talk to you, and you just like, they get a little overwhelmed, and you talk to many, but the quality of conversation is not there. It's a quantity. So I think that's in my ideal world, events that are smaller, more tailored to either an industry or a sector of marketing are the most valuable, where the agencies and vendors are there, but in a strategic and productive way.
Sure. I'll get working on that. I'll have a prospectus on your desk in the next couple of weeks. What was your very first job growing up, or high school, or whenever you had your very first job? What was it?
One of my first jobs was I worked in a laser tag arena that was half laser tag, half restaurant.
Wow. Do tell.
I know, right? So I got really great experience being a waitress, reffing birthday parties, serving food, and then also literally being in the laser tag arena where you're like the referee, and I will bust a complete childhood experience that most people probably had, where if there's two parties and they're playing with each other and like one is losing, part of my job was going and like scoring for the losing point. And you're the ref, so no one expects it. I'm just sitting there like racking up points for, I don't know, like a 10-year-old's birthday party. So that was mine.
Wow. You were running a scam
right?
at this laser tag. Yeah, I was gonna say. I don't know if I can trust you now after knowing you were messing with the results of such an important match. You probably could have ruined some kid's birthday back then.
No, I like to think that we made their birthdays, because if they walked out with no points, that would be devastating. But anyways,
that is fair. Happens. You're not allowed to answer the next question, Blaze. What would be your final meal if you had to pick one?
I'm Persian, Iranian, so I love Persian food. So it would definitely be some type of like saffron rice and kebab, or one of the really delicious stews we have, like hormasabzi, would be my last meal for sure.
Love it. And my final question for you, who is somebody who inspires you either personally or professionally, and why?
Someone who inspires me and has all my life was my great aunt. She was a tennis Olympian. She was a philanthropist. She taught art to many. And she did this all while being a really badass woman in Iran in like the 50s and 30s and 50s and 60s, where that wasn't really popular.
A thing, I imagine.
A thing.
Yeah.
And so she taught me so much of my creativity and being empathetic. And she was like a second grandmother to me. And, on the topic of who inspires you, I think if you've been following the news, it's really all her and all Iranian women right now who are just so brave and are just pillars of example for so many.
Makes me feel terrible for complaining about literally anything going on in my life when I see stuff like that. So no, that's an excellent role model. And I think the best answer we've gotten so far to that question. So I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, of course. Passionate about it.
I bet. This was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. It was worth the wait, I would say, worth the calendaring to get you on the books. But no, I appreciate all the insight, and we'll have to do this again. It sounds like there's plenty more to dive into.
Heck yes. And thank you so much for your time. And you're a wealth of knowledge too, and happy to keep the conversation going.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for checking out this episode of You Should Talk To. This show is brought to you by the company with the same name, You Should Talk To, a company that helps marketing leaders find the right agency or freelancer for their situation. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow You Should Talk To wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit youshouldtalkto.com for more information.